Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into, well, a truly pivotal moment in American history.
Absolutely. We're talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, but specifically how they didn't just, change the Constitution.
Fundamentally remade it.
Exactly. That's the core idea from Eric Foner's book, The Second Founding, which is guiding our deep dive today.
Right. This concept of a second founding, it suggests a constitutional revolution, really. A whole new definition of citizenship, of rights.
It really does. Not just amendments, but a new foundation.
So our mission here is to unpack that. We'll look at the world before, the ideas bubbling up, and then really dig into the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
The heart of it, yeah. Their language, the intent behind them, and what happened right after they were passed. The good and, frankly, the bad.
We're aiming for a pretty detailed academic perspective, grounded in Foner's work, but, keeping it clear and approachable, like we're exploring this together.
And we'll touch on the big legacies, right? Abolition, obviously. Birthright citizenship, like who even is an American. Equality before the law, black male suffrage.
And that huge shift, giving the federal government new power to protect rights.
But also the retreat from those ideals, which is, crucial for understanding why these debates are still so alive.
Okay, so let's set the stage. America, 1860. It's a nation tearing itself apart, but also, think about it, nearly 4 million people are enslaved.
And even the pre-black population, maybe 500,000, faced enormous restrictions. Slavery wasn't some side issue. It was baked into the system, economically, politically, North and South.
And the original Constitution, it was, complicit, wasn't it?
Deeply. Foner calls parts of it weapons of control for slaveholders. Fugitive slave clause, letting the international slave trade continue for 20 years, that 3/5 clause boosting Southern power.
All without actually using the word slavery.
Right. And this dominant idea at the time, the federal consensus, basically everyone agreed the national government couldn't touch slavery in the states. It was purely a state issue.
It's wild to think about now.
And remember who we the people were in 1787. Not enslaved people, not free blacks, no women, no Native Americans. Even many poorer white men were out.
So the second founding really challenges that narrow start.
Definitely. Even the idea of American citizenship itself was so racialized. Crèvecoeur's famous new man, he meant Europeans, Africans, and their descendants. Just not part of that picture for him, despite being here in huge numbers.
But within the anti-slavery movement, there was this intense debate about the Constitution itself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, William Lloyd Garrison, right?
Yeah.
Calling it a covenant with death, burning copies. He thought you couldn't fight slavery from within that system.
But then you had others, including incredibly powerful voices like Frederick Douglass.
Right. Douglass initially agreed with Garrison, but came around to seeing the Constitution potentially as a glorious liberty document.
He and others like Alvin Stewart, Lysander Spooner, they argued slavery had no legal basis under the Constitution. They pointed to things like the Fifth Amendment.
A really different reading.
By 1860, the main Republican Party position was, okay, stop slavery's expansion. And most agreed free blacks deserved basic, natural, and civil rights.
But political rights, social equality, that was a step too far for many, including Lincoln initially. He talked about perfect equality of civil and personal rights, but drew a line at political or social stuff.
And this points to the core problem before the war. Citizenship, what rights came with it, that was mostly defined by the states.
Which meant massive inequality. States could and did pass incredibly discriminatory laws against black people.
Then comes the Dred Scott decision in 1857, just a massive shockwave.
Colossal. Chief Justice Taney didn't just rule against Scott's freedom. He declared that black people, enslaved or free, could never be citizens, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, basically written out of the Constitution's political community.
And he claimed the Constitution protected slave property, said states could make free blacks state citizens maybe, but other states didn't have to recognize it.
The irony, though. Taney describes federal citizenship rights really broadly travel. Bear arms then says, nope, not for black people, none of them.
The reaction must have been intense.
Oh, it was. A huge furor. It put black citizenship right at the center of the national debate. People immediately pushed back with historical and legal arguments showing free blacks had been considered citizens.
Like Justice McLean's dissent.
Exactly. Arguing birth on the soil confers rights. Even the Ohio legislature formally rejected Taney's ruling.
Then the Civil War changes everything, not just preserving the Union, but transforming the federal government itself.
Hugely. Suddenly, the national government is doing things unimaginable before drafting soldiers, creating national banks, income tax. That old idea of absolute state sovereignty, severely weakened, especially for Republicans.
And this new federal power enables things like Attorney General Bates's opinion in 1862.
Right. Flat out saying Dred Scott was wrong. Affirming citizenship for all free persons born here, regardless of race. Though, importantly, he admitted the specific rights of citizenship were still murky. Like women were citizens but couldn't vote.
So these pre-war fights and the war's transformation really set the stage for
The 13th Amendment. The actual abolition of slavery, which, as Foner says, seemed astounding back in 1860.
And it wasn't just one moment, right? It was a process.
Totally. Started by enslaved people themselves running to Union lines. Then the Emancipation Proclamation in '63, huge step, made it a war aim, but it didn't free everyone. Only in Confederate territory and only where the Union Army could enforce it.
So even when Lee surrendered, many were still legally enslaved under state law.
Which is why the 13th Amendment was absolutely crucial. Ratified December 1865. It made abolition permanent, universal, constitutional. Without it, slavery might have limped on.
Lincoln's own views were complicated here.
Yeah. He hated slavery, but he wasn't, a fire-breathing abolitionist from the start. He felt bound by the Constitution's original compromises, hoped for a gradual, ultimate extinction, maybe over a century.
His election was the trigger for secession precisely because it signaled that eventual end. The war forced the issue much faster.
Congress did act during the war, freeing slaves in D.C., the territories, those reaching Union lines, but ending the institution everywhere. That needed an amendment. Lincoln's earlier ideas compensated emancipation, colonization. They went nowhere.
So the amendment itself, the wording is key.
Right, based on the old Northwest Ordinance. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States.
And that was the first time the word slavery actually appeared in the Constitution.
Incredible, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then Section 2, the Enforcement Clause. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation.
That was revolutionary compared to the Bill of Rights.
Totally. The Bill of Rights mostly tells the government what it can't do. This gave Congress affirmative power, a huge grant of authority.
Getting it passed wasn't a sure thing, though.
No, there was definite opposition. Fears about property rights. If you end slave property, what about factories? Racist fear-mongering, too.
But it passed the House in January '65, just barely making the two-thirds needed.
A dramatic moment. Republicans were united, some key Democrats and border state reps came on board. People like Creswell from Maryland talked about how seeing black soldiers fight changed their minds and proved they deserved freedom.
The celebration sounds amazing. Tears, cures. People felt the country was finally becoming truly democratic.
Lincoln called it the King's Cure. He even signed it, which presidents don't usually do for amendments. Shows how significant he thought it was.
Then came ratification, involving President Andrew Johnson.
Yeah, Johnson. Deeply racist, his Reconstruction plan offered freed people basically no protection. But he did push southern states to ratify the 13th as a condition for getting back into the Union.
But that enforcement clause worried the South.
Big time. They saw it gave Congress power over the Negro question. Mississippi actually refused to ratify until 1995 because of it. Others ratified but tried to add statements limiting Congress's power. Georgia's vote in December '65 finally put it over the top.
Beyond just ending bondage, what did Republicans think freedom meant?
That was key. Not just, not being owned. As one congressman said, that's a miserable idea of freedom. It meant having fundamental rights.
The things denied under slavery?
Exactly. The right to marry, own property, testify in court, control your own labor, get an education. They believe the 13th Amendment, especially that enforcement clause, empowered Congress to protect these rights for freed people.
This connects back to that anti-slavery idea of a unified nation, national citizenship, equality before the law.
Yes, and the idea of colonization was dead. Freed people were Americans now. It also tied into the free labor ideology, the right to your own earnings.
Yeah.
After 250 years of unrequited toil, the 13th was seen as preventing states or individuals from denying that right.
But there's that clause. Except as a punishment for crime.
Ah, yes. The prisoner exemption. It came from Thomas Jefferson, way back. Why he put it in isn't totally clear. Maybe fear of idleness, maybe belief in forced labor as reform. It wasn't in most early state abolition laws.
And it wasn't really debated much in 1865.
Not really. Hardly scrutinized. A few people, like Charles Sumner, flagged it as potentially problematic, suggesting it could mean someone convicted of a crime could be essentially re-enslaved. Sumner regretted not fighting it harder.
Someone tried to clarify it.
Yeah, John Casson proposed a resolution saying it just meant direct punishment, not being sold into servitude, but it failed. People thought the upcoming Civil Rights Act would cover it. They were wrong.
So the 13th was huge, radical, but maybe imperfect, part of an ongoing fight.
Definitely. Which leads right into the 39th Congress meeting in late 1865. They walk into a crisis. Johnson's Reconstruction is letting ex-Confederates back into power. Southern states are passing black codes.
Basically trying to reinstate slavery in all but name.
Pretty much. Lots of violence against freed people, too. Congress, deeply distrustful of Johnson and the White South, decided they needed their own Reconstruction plan, and it had to be anchored in the Constitution.
So another amendment was needed.
Right. The Republican majority, a mix of moderates and radicals, agreed abolishing slavery wasn't enough. The federal government had to step up and protect rights.
Though some radicals thought Congress could just act, right, without an amendment.
Yeah, Stevens, Sumner, they argued the South was like conquered provinces, or the Declaration's principles were enough. But that deep-seated Constitution worship, as some called it, meant an amendment felt necessary for legitimacy and permanence.
Before the 14th Amendment itself came the Civil Rights Act of 1866.
Crucial step. Passed over Johnson's veto, a huge deal, first time that happened for major legislation. It defined citizenship, birthright, regardless of race, directly smacked down Dred Scott.
And it listed specific rights.
Yes. Make contracts, sue, testify, own property, equal benefit of all laws, like punishment. It also gave federal courts jurisdiction and, the real kicker, used enforcement mechanisms modeled on the Fugitive Slave Act, turning slavery's tools against its legacy.
Did they think the 13th Amendment gave them power for this act?
Many did, like Senator Trumbull. But others, especially Congressman John Bingham, were skeptical. He thought they needed explicit constitutional authority, an amendment. He actually voted against the act at first for that reason.
Johnson's veto message sounds like it really forced the issue.
Oh, completely. He raised fears of interracial marriage, black suffrage, denied black citizenship, even claimed it was reverse discrimination against whites. That veto made compromise impossible and pushed Republicans straight toward amending the Constitution.
So Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, the absolute heart of it.
Drafted largely by Bingham. First, the Citizenship Clause. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to their jurisdiction. Citizenship based on birthright, nationwide, regardless of race, overturning Dred Scott explicitly.
Creating a national citizenship, really.
For the first time, yeah, with rights attached. Though, racism and local traditions were still huge hurdles.
And then privileges or immunities. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States.
This was meant to be huge. Bingham thought this empowered Congress to make states respect the Bill of Rights. Before this, the Bill of Rights only limited the federal government.
So applying things like free speech protection against state actions.
Exactly. Senator Howard called it incorporation. Vital for protecting basic freedoms, especially in the South. But notice it applies to citizens.
Next, due process. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Borrowed from the Fifth Amendment? Seems straightforward, fair procedures. Wasn't discussed much then.
But it applies to persons, not just citizens.
Key difference. Bingham wanted it broad. And ironically, this clause, not privileges or immunities, later became the main way the Bill of Rights got applied to states and how rights like privacy were protected.
And finally, equal protection. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws.
Making equality a constitutional right for everyone. You could now sue based on inequality. And because it's race neutral, it could eventually be applied beyond race, gender, etc.
The debate then focused on non-discriminatory laws and officials. State action.
Mostly, yeah. But the language, equal protection, hinted it might reach private discrimination too. That was debated.
Wow. Section 1 really was a sea change, as Foner calls it, making rights national.
Fundamentally altered the whole system. But it wasn't perfect. There were compromises. Section 2, on representation. It didn't grant black suffrage nationwide.
Right. It penalized states for disenfranchising adult males by reducing their representation, but explicitly not for disenfranchising women.
Yeah, a painful compromise for women's rights advocates. It left voting rules with states, but put a penalty on racial discrimination in voting for the first time.
Section 3 banned former Confederates from office.
to prevent the old guard from taking back control and ensure governments would actually uphold Section 1. Stevens thought it was too soft.
So this new federalism recognized states were often the problem.
Exactly. Unlike the Bill of Rights limiting Congress, these amendments gave Congress power to enforce rights, and they expected Congress, not the courts, to lead that enforcement.
Democrats opposed all this.
Fiercely. White supremacy was central to their arguments. They praised Dred Scott, feared extending citizenship advantages to non-whites, saw it as destroying states' rights.
Stevens called it patching up the Constitution, but the best they could get.
Living among men and not among angels, as he put it. And for a brief time, during radical Reconstruction, new biracial Southern governments wrote state constitutions reflecting these principles.
What about Black Americans themselves? How did they see these changes?
Their role was crucial. Black conventions, organizers, newspapers, they were educating people on what the Constitution meant, demanding equality.
The same rights as white men, nothing more, nothing less.
Exactly. And they had a broad view of rights, access to public places, schools, distinguishing it from, forced social equality, and suffrage. They saw it as the heart and soul of their freedom. Essential.
Needing the federal government to back it up.
Absolutely. Countless petitions detailed the violence, the lack of state protection, pleading for that strong arm of the general government.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the 15th Amendment.
Right. By 1869, black men were voting in the reconstructed South, but not in border states or parts of the North. It seemed illogical, absurd, and there was fear those new Southern voting rights could be taken away.
And the Republican view of suffrage was evolving.
Yeah, increasingly seen not just as useful, but as a fundamental right, at least for men, necessary for citizenship.
So the 15th aimed to secure black male suffrage everywhere.
Permanently, preventing denial based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
The debates were significant.
First big national discussion on voting rights. Is it a right, a privilege? Went beyond black men to Chinese immigrants, women. The final wording, though, was negative. The right to vote shall not be denied or abridged.
Not an affirmative guarantee to vote?
Exactly. Just prohibits denial based on those specific reasons. And many saw this as a huge loophole.
How so?
Critics like Schellebarger warned states could use non-racial requirements, poll taxes, literacy tests that would in practice block most black voters. He called it an almost fatal defect. Bingham thought it was too weak.
So even supporters weren't thrilled.
Many voted for it reluctantly. Best I can get was the feeling, regretting it wasn't stronger.
But it passed, and Grant pushed for ratification.
And those Southern biracial governments were key, ratifying quickly. Congress even made ratification a condition for the remaining states to rejoin.
The celebrations in 1870 sound incredible.
Huge parades, speeches linking it to the Declaration, to global democracy, a moment of profound hope.
But it caused a split in the women's movement.
A painful one. It barred racial limits on voting, but not gender limits. Anthony and Stanton saw it as actively creating a new barrier for women. The Purvis anecdote, father versus son, highlights the tension, the male patriarchal views.
And the violence continued, right, targeting voters.
Relentlessly. The Klan's terror campaign. Testimony from victims really broadened the idea of rights to include just basic safety. And again, the call went out for federal protection when states failed.
Leading to the Enforcement Acts?
1870, 1871. Really powerful laws expanding federal power against Klan violence, intimidation, especially around voting. Authorized marshals, troops, federal trials.
The 1871 Act even targeted private conspiracies.
Yes, the Ku Klux Klan Act. It reenacted parts of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, extending protection beyond just state action. Senator Poole argued they had to go after individuals.
And Grant used these powers.
He did. Suspended habeas corpus in South Carolina, sent the Army. Thousands of arrests, hundreds of federal trials. Conviction rates were low, but the sheer scale of federal action broke the Klan's organized power for a time.
Even the Democrats started to shift tactics.
By 1872, realized the overt violence was hurting them in the North, so they started outwardly accepting the amendments, trying to seem more moderate.
So a period of incredible change, then federal action, but then the courts step in.
And this is where the story takes that tragic turn. Starting in the early 1870s, the Supreme Court begins interpreting these amendments. And their decisions, over decades, largely dismantle the Second Founding's promise, especially for black Americans.
Even with Republican appointees on the court.
Many of them, yes. It wasn't inevitable. Foner argues it was a series of choices, reflecting and reinforcing the national retreat from Reconstruction. A really sad chapter, as he puts it.
Let's walk through some key cases. Slaughterhouse in 1873.
The first big were on the 14th, ostensibly about a Louisiana butchering monopoly.
Mm.
But the court used it to interpret the Privileges or Immunities Clause, and they interpreted it narrowly, incredibly narrowly. Justice Miller said P or I of U.S. citizenship only included rights dependent on the federal government travel to D.C., using ports. It did not include basic civil rights protected by states before the amendment.
So it created two separate citizenships, state and federal, and made the federal one almost meaningless for basic rights.
Pretty much. It gutted the clause Bingham thought would be the main tool for protecting rights against states. Critics immediately saw it as crippling the amendment, like a new Dred Scott.
The dissents were strong, though.
Very. Arguing the majority made the amendment vain and idle, that national citizenship was now primary, the system had changed. They saw the clause was meant to protect all citizens' fundamental rights.
And other rulings followed quickly. Against women's rights, too.
Yes, Bradwell denied Myra Bradwell a law license based on her sex. Minor v. Happersett said citizenship doesn't automatically mean the right to vote, upholding denying women suffrage.
Then the civil rights cases in 1883. What happened there?
That struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which banned discrimination in public accommodations, hotels, theaters. Justice Bradley said the 14th Amendment only applied to state action.
Meaning discrimination by private businesses wasn't covered.
Exactly. The court called it a private wrong, not a constitutional violation Congress could fix under the 14th, denied Congress power to act against private discrimination.
Despite the arguments that these businesses were open to the public.
Right. Justice Harlan made that point powerfully in his dissent, arguing the Constitution should be colorblind. But he was alone. The decision was a huge blow.
And these rulings paved the way for segregation.
They did. Even earlier, Hall v. DeCoeur struck down a state anti-discrimination law on steamboats, saying it burdened commerce. This implied segregation was fine if Congress didn't act, ignoring the 1875 Act.
Leading ultimately to Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896.
The infamous separate but equal case, challenging Louisiana's segregated railway cars. Homer Plessy was chosen deliberately because he could pass for white.
And the court upheld segregation.
Yes. Said it was fine if facilities were equal, rejected the idea that segregation was a badge of slavery or violated equal protection.
Harlan's dissent there is legendary.
It really is. Calling the Constitution colorblind, warning segregation was a badge of servitude, predicting it would fuel racial hatred. He knew it was wrong and would eventually be overturned.
The 15th Amendment was also gutted.
Effectively nullified in the South by the early 1900s. States passed laws with poll taxes, literacy tests, things that weren't explicitly racial, but designed to disenfranchise black men.
And the court upheld these.
In cases like Williams v. Mississippi, yes. Said if the law didn't mention race on its face, the discriminatory effect didn't matter constitutionally. They also limited federal power to prosecute private individuals interfering with voting.
So judicial interpretation really undid much of the work.
For decades, yes. But even then, black leaders and lawyers didn't just accept it. Foner highlights this alternative jurisprudence. People like T. Thomas Fortune, groups like the Brotherhood of Liberty, they kept arguing for the broader intended meaning of the amendments, for strong federal enforcement. Treatises like Justice and Jurisprudence called out the courts for betraying the amendments. That counter-narrative never died.
Looking back now, it's clear the amendments didn't immediately transform everything.
Far from it. Today, the 13th Amendment is often discussed, mainly for that, except as punishment for crime clause and its connection to mass incarceration, forced labor, its potential power against systemic racism from slavery's legacy, largely untapped.
And the 15th?
Less central now, though it was the basis for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But voting rights are still fiercely contested, with courts often upholding laws like felony disenfranchisement that disproportionately affect black voters due to biases in the justice system.
The 14th is the most complicated legacy, maybe.
In some ways, equal protection has been used for massive expansions of rights, voting rights, one person, one vote, gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights. But for its original purpose, addressing racial inequality stemming from slavery, its impact has been more limited. Courts often dismiss societal racism.
While due process became the main vehicle for applying the Bill of Rights to states.
Right, and privileges or immunities. Still mostly dead letter after Slaughterhouse.
That post-Reconstruction retreat still casts a long shadow.
It really does. But Foner's point, and what this history shows, is that those narrow interpretations weren't the only way to read these amendments. That counterinterpretation exists rooted in the history itself.
A vision of broader rights, stronger national citizenship, real federal power to enforce them.
Exactly. There's historical grounding for arguing the 13th can fight modern inequality rooted in slavery, that the 14th's P or I clause could include rights like education or fair wages,
Hmm.
that voting should be a basic right of citizenship, that courts can address systemic racism, that state action shouldn't block federal power against private discrimination.
We don't have to rely on things like the Commerce Clause for racial justice.
The potential is there in the amendments themselves. These sleeping giants, as Foner calls them.
Waiting for us to demand their full meaning.
Something for all of us to think about, definitely.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into Eric Foner's The Second Founding. It's quite a journey through a time that truly remade America.
A powerful reminder that the Constitution isn't static. It's shaped by struggle, by ideals, by setbacks, and, by ongoing interpretation.
We hope exploring the origins, the words, and the complicated history of these amendments has given you a deeper understanding of this crucial period.
And why it still matters so much today.
Thanks for joining us. We really encourage you to reflect on this history, the immense promise, the tragic retreat, and the potential that still lies within these foundational texts.